In this lesson, we'll look at the timeline and some of the basic things you need to know about creating animations. At the base and is off by default. So in order to begin doing animations or working with the timeline, you're going to need to go to the View menu and enable the timeline by selecting on Show Timeline. Now, the timeline can be expanded up or down by dragging from that little divider that separates it from the canvas area. In most cases, the size that you have is probably going to work out okay for you. Let's take a look at some of the basic functions and the different buttons and operators that you need to use in making animations. First of all, this orange button here on the far side is really the key to creating animations. This allows you to start and stop animation mode so that when you're in Adobe Roam, you can automatically record changes to objects as they happen on the canvas. The big button allows us to turn on and turn off animation mode. And then there are some pretty small little controls down here right along the timeline. You have the options, for instance, to create a new loop or a new trigger event. We'll use some of those options when we get into our hands-on projects later on. You also can twirl down and have access to these specific control points or key points that you can create within your animation. And of course, then we have the timeline itself, which shows you objects as they change over time. The playhead is like the playhead in most time-based animations or editing tools. You can slide it back and forth to get to a certain location within your little movie or animation that you're making. And of course, down at the bottom, you have some zoom controls that let you zoom in tighter, or more broadly, again, watch the timeline here. What you're actually zooming in on is the timeline itself. So if you want to have really quick animations, you turn the magnification of the timeline to the far right. Those that take a long time would work on the far left over there. So a lot of things going on here with the timeline, a lot of little controls, many of which you won't need to use if you're doing a simple animation like I'll demonstrate next. But if you want to work with students who are doing more complicated and complex animations, perhaps as a preparation for a career ed class in, say, Flash or another program similar to that, then you have some of the same kind of controls that you find in those sophisticated programs. So a lot of cool things can happen with animation in Adobe Roam. The animation sequence of how we would do things, and I've got a little object, just a circle drawn here on my canvas. Remember, first thing we have to do is show the timeline, so I'll select on that. And now I can turn on the animation feature and begin recording what happens as I move through the timeline. So I want this to happen pretty quickly, so I'm going to zoom to the right a little bit on my timeline so I can see these time markers that allow things to happen a little more quickly. And to make my animation begin, what I'll do is I'll take my control head, my play head, and I'll move it to the location where I want my first change to take place. So essentially what we're doing is we're kind of mapping out the important moments in time along the timeline when things take place. So at the beginning of my timeline, over on the left, where my playhead is here, the beginning of time, I have my ball in the upper left-hand corner. And now what I want to do at this point is I want to move it down to the bottom of the canvas. Now what you'll notice is you see this line that appears. This is my animation path. This shows me how things will happen along that line. And we saw that tool earlier before, the toolbar, and we'll take a harder look at it here in just a moment. All right, so there's my first point that I want to move to. Now I'll take my timeline and drag it down, and now I'll move my ball to the next location. You see how the animation timeline follows along. All right, and we'll go to the next control point or the next important point that's happening, or key point, or keyframe, lots of different things that we can call those. Now my ball is going to kind of go up above the stage a little bit and be a little bit hidden. And then finally, just so we get an idea again how the difference in time affects an animation, I'm going to slide down a little further on the timeline, and this time I'm going to bring my ball down to the bottom. So these key points here, these key frames, are marked out. When I look at my timeline a little more carefully, you'll see by twirling down those options, I can see the individual key points or key moments within my animation where things have changed. Alright, and I'll use the play button up at the top to preview and see how things look. Okay, so pretty good little animation going on there. Again, we'll just we can hit the preview button again, see how things bounce around on the screen, get a pretty good idea of how an animation is done. We see how the timeline affects where these key points are located, how that affects the timing of our animation. All these things are going to come into play as we do a little bit more work later on. And of course, we also, as we saw before, we'll go back and take a look at the animation path tool. You remember that guy? And the animation path tool allows me to actually change these points. So let's say I don't like the angle that I took on that one. I can change that animation point. Or I can add points, and I can even create tangents. So I can change my my animation path to a curved path. And all this is going to be kind of fun as we go a little bit further in our look at animation. So now I've got a curved path that my animation is going to follow. Let's do one more here and do the same thing. Using my animation path tool, I'll create these tangents, and now I can have some things that follow a curve as the animation takes place. I'm just going to drag those out. Let's see what we get now in the preview. Okay, see how we got a little curve going on there, all pretty quick. One final thing, you can change the length of an animation by simply dragging this gray bar. So if I decided that my animation was a little bit too fast, I could just make it last longer by giving it more time on the timeline. And now when I play, we'll see my animation takes a little more time to progress. All right, so that's a quick overview of the timeline and some of the animation tools provided in Adobe Roam. We'll be looking at more animation projects as we move through this course.